Most people believe the California Gold Rush was a saga of lawless shootouts and collapsing tunnels. But the most terrifying killer wasn't a bullet. It was a silent silver mist that literally ate your personality. In 1876, a miner named John Connor was found dead in his cabin. He wasn't injured, but he had gone strange, terrified of shadows and unable to hold a spoon without shaking. He was a victim of erethism, a mercury-induced madness caused by the 10 million pounds of quicksilver used to wash California's gold. To the mining barons, this wasn't a tragedy. It was a production norm. Why did the world's most famous fortune seekers trade their sanity for a silver reflection on the walls? Today we're uncovering the brutal chemistry of the West, where the price of gold wasn't just blood, but the very soul of the men who found it. Nevada County, California, 1876. The cabin sat 4 miles from the stamp mill where Connor had worked for 8 years. Neighbors said he had gone strange. The county physician entered into the record nervous excitation and general exhaustion. Nobody looked for the cause in the silver shimmer that settled on the mill walls every morning like frost that never melted. The expected danger in a California stamp mill was obvious to anyone who walked through the door. The stamps themselves, cast iron heads weighing between 400 and 900 pounds, rose and dropped 80 to 100 times a minute, each cycle reducing gold-bearing rock to a gray slurry that ran across the floor in a thin, grinding stream. The sound was not impact. It was continuous percussion felt in the sternum before a man crossed the threshold. The floor vibrated. The iron frames sweated. A worker who spent 10 years in a stamp mill expected his hearing to go. He expected the joints to ache. He watched for the hazards he could name. He did not watch for the mercury. The slurry flowed across copper plates coated with a thin film of quicksilver. Mercury, delivered in 76-pound iron flasks from the mines at New Almaden in the hills south of San Jose, where the Quicksilver Mining Company had been operating since the 1840s and held a near monopoly on California supply. Gold particles bound to the mercury on contact, forming amalgam, a dense, heavy alloy that clung to the plates while the waste rock washed away. The chemistry was efficient. The air above the plates was not a concern anyone had written into an operating procedure. Mercury begins to vaporize at room temperature. In a California summer with a stamp mill running at full capacity, the air above the amalgamation plates was warm enough to accelerate that process measurably. The vapor was colorless. It had no smell strong enough to register as warning. The men who stood over those plates, called amalgamators, breathed it for 10-hour shifts, 6 days a week, in rooms where the only ventilation was an open window when the weather permitted. The word erethism did not circulate in Nevada County mining camp. What circulated was a different vocabulary, quieter and more damaging precisely because it described a man's character rather than his condition. He's gotten nervous. He doesn't come around anymore. His hands shake even when he's not cold. The symptoms of chronic mercury poisoning developed across years. Insomnia first, then irritability, then a fine tremor in the fingers that worsened under observation. Then the pathological shyness. Men who had been known talkers at the bar becoming unable to tolerate a room with more than 2 people in. Then memory loss, then paranoia. In the final state, delirium, and the complete dissolution of a recognizable self. It did not look like a disease. It looked like a man who had simply changed. County physicians in the mining districts wrote what the language available permitted them to write. Nervous exhaustion, brain excitation, constitutional weakness. These entries closed cases. They did not open investigations. From 1850 through the early 1900s, California gold processors used an estimated 10 million pounds of quicksilver. The New Almaden operation alone by 1865 was producing more metallic wealth than any gold mine in it. The supply chain was tight, the prices were tracked quarterly, and the losses during processing, between 10 and 30% per season, absorbed into tailings and riverbed sediment, and the air above the amalgamation plates were entered as a materialist. There was no line in any operating ledger for what that vapor did to the man standing of it. The ledger was not designed to hold that kind of arithmetic. Nevada County Register of Employment, Grass Valley, California, April 1881. The entry reads, Thomas Ferris, age 34, occupation, amalgamator, shift length, 10 hours, 6 days a week, no notation of protective equipment, no notation of ventilations. The column for hazard classification is blank, not because the form didn't have one, but because no one had defined amalgamation work as hazardous under California labor statutes of their. At the macro level, 1881 was a stable year old. Price. Mill owners in Nevada County expanded output by lengthening shifts and increasing stamp counts per patent. From that period document dozens of improvements to stamp mechanism, dropsy, cam geometry, dotness. Not one patent filed in that decade addressed vapor containment in a mess. The industry's primary trade publication, the Mining and Scientific Press out of San Francisco, ran regular columns on improving amalgam yield. It ran nothing on amalgamation. The two subjects existed in separate universes. One measured in troy ounces, the other not at all. At the micro level, Thomas Ferris knew something was wrong approximately a year before his hands began shaking visibly enough for unnotice. The knowledge was physical before it was nameable. A tightness behind the eyes after a shift, sleep that didn't restore, an irritability that arrived without cause and left without a nation. He had been, before the mill, a sociable man, a known presence at the Sons of the Golden West Lodge, Grass Valley. Someone held a room. By 1881, he avoided the law entirely. He told his wife tiredness. No one recorded what himself. At the mass level, the mining towns had their own diagnostic system and social. In Grass Valley, Nevada City, and Downeyville, the men who worked the amalgamation plates were recognizable after a few years in the same way a sailor is recognizable as gait, not from any single feature, but luster, the trained hands, the avert eyes, the particular wariness movement, as if the body had learned to treat every surface as potentially stable. They were called millmen, in a tone that meant something beyond patient. The town accommodated quietly, the way communities accommodate what they cannot explain and cannot afford front. What the community could not name, the industry had already encountered in a different country and a century. Spanish mining manuals from the 16th and 17th centuries circulated among engineers who operated the mercury mines at Almaden in Extremadura described the symptoms of what they called hydrogeria, mercury sickness, in precise terms: tremor, mental disturbance, loss of muscle control, death in it. The Almaden operation had instituted worker rotation by the 18th century, limiting exposure time per shift, not from humanitarian principle but from practical one. They kept losing trained labor faster than they replaced it. In 1865, journalist and federal agent John Ross Brown visited the new Almaden mines and submitted a report to Washington. He noted explicitly that both the mining company and the owners of gold processing mills had access to the European technical literature on mercury hazard. It traveled with the technology itself, passed between engineers the way operating manuals pass mechanics. The knowledge existed. It simply had not been applied to the question of worker shift duration in California mill rooms. No records suggest anyone why not. The California Mining Bureau's annual report for 1869 contains a passage that reads close reading. Between columns of production figures and meteorological data, the inspector for Nevada County noted, amalgamators, frequent turnover of personnel is observed, attributable to nervous unsuitability labor, not disease, poisoning, nervous unsuitability, as though the problem resided in the men rather than the vapor they breathed, for 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, in a room designed for gold recovery and not occupation. High turnover in the amalgamate position was, in statistical terms, the readable trace of mass poisoning. Rendered as a personnel note, it became a production variable, something to manage with wages, not inflation. When the fourth amalgamator in Nevada County died within a single calendar year, 1882, causes recorded as paralysis and exhaustion, the funeral at Grass Valley Cemetery drew 7 people: his wife, 2 children, co-workers, the mill owner present. At the following week's foreman's meeting, he was informed that two amalgamators had proven unfit for continued service and would require replacement. He noted it and returned to the mercury expenditure column. The number in that column was the one that mattered. It always had been. Consolidated Gold Mines of Nevada County, Shareholder Report, 1884, page 14, line item, mercury expenditure for the season, $4,840. Line item directly below, payments to families of deceased or incapacitated workers, $0. Not because no one had died, not because no one had lost the use of their hands or their memory or their ability to recognize their children at the supper table, because the company was under no legal obligation to acknowledge any connection between work at the mill and nervous exhaustion. The disease had no name in California tort law. It had no precedent in any state court ruling. It was, legally speaking, not a workplace condition. It was a personal misfortune that happened to occur near a workplace. The expected response is outrage and individual greed. But what operated in the California mining districts of the 1870s and 1880s was not a moral failure of particular men. It was a structural rationality, a system in which a disease developed across years, left no single identifiable moment of causation, and carried symptoms indistinguishable from character, simply did not exist as a category that law, medicine, or accounting equipped to process. Each decision taken within that system, not to ventilate, not to rotate personnel, to pay compensation, was defensible within the available framework. That is precisely what makes the system so durable. Installing or retrofitting a closed ventilation system in an average state in the 1880s cost between $200 and $600 as a one capital expense. A new amalgamator could be $1 a day. No California court before 1900 ruled against a mill owner for mercury poisoning of a worker because the plaintiff bore the burden of proving direct causation, and Arethism's symptoms were consistently reattributed by company physicians to intemperate habits, natural nervous disposition, the catch-all of the era. Constant weakness. The defense did not need to disprove the connection. It only needed to introduce alternative explanations, and the medicine of the period sim in abundance. In 1878, an engineer employed at one of the large mills in Nevada County, identified in surviving documents only as the company's technical engineer, his name absent from the accessible record, prepared an internal memorandum documenting hazardous mercury vapor concentration in the amalgamation room. He recommended forced ventilation and a 4-hour maximum continuous exposure limit for workers handling amalgam directly. The memorandum reached the superintendent's desk. The superintendent did not respond in writing. A written response would have constituted legal acknowledgement of a known hazard. The engineer left the company within the same quarter. No reason is listed in the employment register. 43 years later, in 1921, when California first enacted mandatory ventilation standards for mercury handling facilities, that category of internal memorandum, not that specific document, but its type, appeared repeatedly in legislative testimony as evidence of long suppressed institutional knowledge. The legislature did not need to find the original. By 1921, there were enough identical documents from enough identical desk drawers to establish the pattern reasonable argument. Between 1878 and 1890, across Nevada County, El Dorado County, and Tuolumne County, a statistical pattern in plain sight. Amalgamators and mill workers with direct mercury contact left the workforce in significant numbers after 5 to 8 years of service, categorized variously as dismissed for incapacity, voluntarily departed, or simply absent from subsequent records. Local newspapers did not report this as a pattern, but the employment advertisements in the Mining Gazette and the Nevada Daily Transcript told it plainly to anyone reading carefully. Amalgamator positions were advertised quarterly, consistently, at wage premiums of comparable mill positions. No advertisement explained the premium. No explanation was needed. The men already in the district. The premium existed because the position would fill a second time. A man who had worked the plates for 2 or 3 years understood what the money was for. Not skill, not seniority, but the cost of continuing. Mill owners understood it too. The premium cheaper than the ventilation. The math was not complicated, and no one intended otherwise in the documents that were meant to leave the counting house. What was complicated, what took decades and a different legal art to finally address, was finding a mechanism that could make the private arithmetic visible in a public forum. It carried consequences. Until that mechanism existed, the core amalgamators ran. The flasks of quicksilver are New Almaden on schedule, and the men who answered the advertisement stood over and breathed what came off them, because in Nevada in the 1880s, $2 a day and a premium was still more than most alternatives offered. County, California, Monday, March 4, 1887. Shift at the mill did not assemble. No ultimatum had been issued. No meeting had been called. No leaflets had circulated in boarding houses the night before. At 6 in the morning, one man out of 8 assigned to the amalgamation walked through the gate. The other 7 did not appear, each separately, each without written explanation. The superintendent assumed weather. By the 3rd consecutive day, he understood it was not weather. The expected shape of labor resistance in the American West of the 1880s had a recognizable form: a spokesman, a list of demands, a crowd at the gate. What happened around mercury mills did not have that form. It had the form of a mass silent refusal, a behavioral signal with no author and no document, which the company could neither punish through legal channels nor explain to shareholders in terms that made sense. Men simply stopped coming, and that particular form of pressure, precisely because it was invisible to newspapers and produced no prosecutable act, was in some ways more difficult to absorb than a formal strike. A strike could be broken with replacement workers and a sheriff's detail. A reputation could not be broken, only outlasted, and only if the supply of men who had heard held out long enough. Information in the California mining districts moved faster than any print publication. Knew each other across mill boundaries. Wives spoke at the market. The boys who hauled provisions to the mill yards conversations back with the empty crates. The mercury reputation of a specific operation, whether it was known as a hard place or a place where men don't last, was living community knowledge that never entered any official record, but governed labor supply surely as the posted wage rate. When several amalgamators from one mill in 1887 entered the condition their neighbors did as nervous collapse, what a physician today would recognize as to late-stage erethism. The news moved the mining district within 2 weeks, not through the Nevada transcript, which did not cover it, through people, crew to crew, board saloon to church pew. The mills with the worst mercury reputations faced chronic staffing shortages and compensated by raising daily rates or importing workers from other states, not yet learned what the premium was for. The cycle was self-sustaining. It required no conspiracy to operate. It required only that the cost of telling the truth exceeded the cost of not telling it. In 1880, 129 workers at the Guadalupe mine, a mixed workforce of Euro-Americans, Mexicans, and Chinese laborers, filed a joint legal claim against the company for unpaid wages. It was one of the rare documented instances of cross-ethnic labor solidarity in California's mining industry of that period. But at most mercury and gold mills, Chinese workers occupied the most toxic positions, not by choice, but through a subcontracting structure that separated them from direct company employment and consequently any avenue of legal redress. When the California legislature tightened restrictions on Chinese employment in mining industries in 1882, the motion was not health protection. But one of the unintended consequences was that mills lost the most consistently replaceable pool of unskilled labor for the most dangerous operations, and the staffing arithmetic shifted in ways no one had planned for. In 1889, Nevada County physician Charles Mary compiled a report for the County Board of Health describing a concentration of nervous disorders among the population of the mining districts and identifying noxious mercury vapor in ore process closures as the probable cause. The board had no statutory authority over industrial facilities. The report produced no regulatory action. It was filed and remained in the county archive, where it sat for a quarter century. In 1914, when California's nascent industrial hygiene apparatus began assembling the documentary basis for what would become the state's first occupational health standards, Mary's 1889 report was cited in legislative testimony as an early documented one that the system had ignored. The legislators who cited it were not by that point interested in assigning blame to a specific company or a specific superintendent. They were interested in the pattern, the repeating structure in which a competent observer documented a hazard, submitted the documentation through the available, and the channel led nowhere. Mary's report was precisely because it was one of many. A single document could be dismissed as an outlier. A sequence of identical documents, separated by years and jurisdictions, described something that could no longer be called an oversight. The county board that received Mary's report in 1889 noted it. The word by this point requires no explanation. United States Patent Number 189,347, April 10, 1877. Applicant: a San Francisco engineer firm operated in the Sierra Nevada supply trade. The patent described a closed retorting system for amalgam processing, a sealed iron vessel in which the gold-mercury mixture was heated, the mercury vapor condensed through a water-cooled coil, liquid metal recovered for reuse. The document was precise on dimensions, material specifications, and operating temperatures. It was also precise application language on the secondary benefit: elimination of mercury vapor from the environment during the retorting step. The capital cost for a unit sized to a mid-range stamp mill, between $100 and $300 installed. The technology existed. That is the point the record makes clearly. It is worth holding for a moment before moving past it. The closed retort was not a future solution awaiting invention. It was awaiting adoption. Patents for enclosed amalgam processing appeared through the 1870s and found genuine uptake at larger industrial operations, where mercury represented a significant line item. Recovery directly affected quarterly returns. At those operations, the closed system made financial sense because the material it conserved was expensive to justify the capital outlay. At small and mid-sized stamp mills, the arithmetic ran differently. Through most of the 1870s, a flask of quicksilver from New England cost between $30 and $60. Processing losses of 10 to 30 per season were absorbed as a materials expense. Mercury prices fell in the early 1880s, driven by overproduction at New Almaden and increasing competition from Spanish suppliers shipping almadenabar to East Coast processors. The economic incentive to all recovery equipment largely disappeared. Cheap mercury made the closed retort an optional upgrade rather than a financial necessity. Cheap mercury also made sick workers cheaper, because cheap mercury meant the cost of replacing the material lost through open-air retorting was lower than the cost equipment that would have prevented the loss. And replacing lost mercury was cheaper than containing it. Replacing the man who had stood in the vapor for 5 years, cheaper still than ventilating the room where he stood. 3 separate decisions: mercury pricing, capital equipment, and labor replacement, each internally coherent, each made without explicit reference to the others, converged into a single operational reality. The closed retort sat in the patent record. The amalgamator stood over the open plate. Quicksilver Mining Company, which controlled the New Almaden operation south of San Jose after a confrontation with federal troops in the 1860s that resolved title in the company's favor, held effective price-setting authority in the California mercury market for decades. The company's technical staff understood the hazard profile of their product. The European mining literature on mercury toxicity was part of the engineering knowledge that accompanied the amalgamation process from its Spanish and Mexican antecedents into California practice. But QMC sold mercury. It did not process gold. The legal distance between the manufacturer of a hazardous material and the employer of the workers exposed to it was, in the absence of any statute bridging that gap, absolute. No 18th century California plaintiff successfully crossed it. Mill owners knew the hazard at the point of use. Mercury suppliers knew the hazard of the material. Neither was legally liable because the law had not yet constructed the category of responsibility that would have made either of them so. This was not a loophole exploited by clever attorneys. It was simply the shape of the legal landscape before occupation existed as a field with enforceable standards. In 1921, during the demolition of an abandoned mill in Nevada City, workers clearing a bricked interior niche between retort room walls found a sealed metal box. Inside, a bundle of correspondence from 1879 to 1883 between the mill superintendent and a regional representative of the mercury supplier. One letter from the supplier's representative reads, "The record suggests this is authentic, though the full archive has been independently verified, as a direct caution, recommending ventilation during heating, citing reports from several clients of worker ill following prolonged work in enclosed rooms. Superintendent's reply is not in the box. California, Sierra Nevada Watershed, 2005, United States Geological Survey report, contamination from historical gold mining operation." At the center of that report is not an estimate. It is the result of decade-long geochemical mapping of river sediments, floodplain deposits, and reservoir beds across the Sierra Nevada foothills. From the 1860s through the early 1900s, California gold processors used approximately 10 million pounds of quicksilver. Of that total, roughly 3 million pounds, used specifically in hard rock stamp mill amalgamation, remain in the ecosystem, in the river mud, sediment behind dams decades after the mills closed, in the tissue of fish. The expected response is that this is a problem of the past, sealed in history along with the mills themselves. The USGS mapping established otherwise. Mercury deposited in Sierra Nevada tanks and stream beds during the 1870s and 1880s does not stay where it was left. It migrates through slope erosion and seasonal flooding. More significantly, it undergoes microbial conversion to methylmercury, the organic form that moves the chains, concentrating at each level. Fish consumption advisories for sport-caught fish from waters downstream of former Sierra Gold districts remain active today, specifically targeting pregnant women and children. The contamination has not peaked and declined. In some monitored watersheds, it continues to move. The human chain connecting the 1880s amalgamation room to the present is not purely geological. In the 1990s, the California Department of Health Services conducted blood level testing among members of the Pomo tribe resident former Sulphur Bank mercury mine in Lake County, an operation applied quicksilver to gold mills since the 1860s. Some community members declined be tested, not from ignorance of what the results might show, but from a specific foreknowledge. Their parents and grandparents had worked the mine, and they already understood, in the wordless way that communities understand what they have survived, what the numbers would say. One elder, whose father died at 59 with what the family described as trembling hands, slurred speech, and a fearfulness of people he had once known well, a clinical picture that read as late-stage erethism, tonalist. All those years, none of us knew. That sentence appeared in print in 1999, 80 years after the first California sanitary inspector had the statutory to require ventilation in mercury handling facilities. 120 years after the letter of caution answered into the metal box between the retort room walls. The gold that California's stamp mills produced in the 1860s and 1900 financed railroads, municipal systems, the first major American industrial banking class, a capital formation that underwent the next generation of Western expansion. The names of companies that grew from that capital outlasted mills, the workers, and every regulatory framework that could have been enacted but was not enacted in time. Mercury those mills left in the Sierra Nevada will outlast the companies, the shareholders, the legislators who tabled the ventilation proposals, and any statute passed to address what they declined to prevent. The USGS published updated intercontamination maps of the Sierra Nevada in 2024, detailed to individual water bodies, coded by mercury concentration relative PA thresholds. The maps, like damage assessments, dense clusters of elevated readings, sit where the mill sites were recorded in 18th century mining surveys. Most of the structures are gone, rotted bricks scattered, foundation taken by scrub. What remains is what was released in the sediment, in the food chain, in the specific silence of communities. Learn to describe a man's disappearance into tremor and paranoia as a change in character rather than death. They do not build mills like that anymore. The men who stood over the open plates are gone, and so are the company ledgers that never found a line for what happened to them. But the methyl mercury is still moving downstream. It has no ledger entry either, no cost center, no liability column, no rounding error in a quarterly report. It is simply present, the way it has been present since the first flask of New Almaden quicksilver was poured across a copper plate in the Sierra foothills, and the man standing above it breathed in and did not think to ask what was in the air. He had no reason to ask. Nobody had given him one.